Hello there, John Coturillo here, the counsellor of your listener. Thank you for joining me for this episode. Today I'm going to be discussing some of the nuances, both practical and philosophical, of how we define words and specifically the implications of the definitions that we give to words on the way that we live our lives. Now, as per usual, never take what you see or hear on the internet as advice. If you have concerns of any type, please seek professional advice. I'm not suggesting what people should or shouldn't believe here. I'm simply providing perspectives for you to consider in the way that you view the world. Now, to begin, remember that words are human created. Nature didn't invent words and tell us what the definitions of those words would be. Nature, of course, did give us the ability to create language and to use language, but we ultimately had to do the rest. We had to create words and give them definitions. And the most basic purpose of language is to communicate ideas. And we define words and phrases so that when someone uses a particular communication, they can be reasonably assured that the person receiving that communication is going to understand exactly the idea to which that person is referring. And so consistency is very important there. However, when we give a word a meaning and collectively as a society we accept that it has that meaning, it then creates an implication that we must apply that meaning consistently and behave consistently with that meaning. And as generations develop and they are taught the meanings of certain words and then are taught that those words are applied to given situations or given ideas, entities, etc., they learn how to behave in certain situations and towards certain ideas and entities based on the meanings that they're taught of those words. And so it's very important that when we decide the definition of a word and collectively agree on it, that we also understand what the practical implications of that definition is. In other words, being able to foresee and account for how society may potentially function if given words that have particular importance are given certain definitions and we behave consistently with those definitions. Now, that's one of the concerns that we must consider when we take a social constructionist approach to life. And social constructionism is the basic philosophy that objective reality very seldom, if at all, exists, and that what we consider to be true is only based on ideas that are taught to us. That is to say, ideas that are made by humans and not created by nature. Now, the meaning of words technically is arbitrary. There's nothing to say that we have to use particular words to communicate particular ideas. Humans created the definitions of words. However, when we refer to specific ideas that occur in nature, specific phenomena, the nature of the phenomena doesn't change based on how we refer to it using words. It doesn't change based on the definitions of the words either, but it changes how we behave in relation to it. And some behaviours in response to certain events may be adaptive, that is to say, they're helpful, they're constructive, and they aid survival and help us function as a society, and other behaviours may be maladaptive, that is to say harmful. So even though we assign meaning to words, the implications of how we use the words themselves, which largely has to do with the definitions we give them, does have real world consequences. Now this is quite vague, so let's use some concrete examples. The first example with which I'm particularly familiar, given this is my area of practice, is mental illness. The commonly accepted definition of mental illness is often drawn from the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the guide that defines the diagnostic criteria for a range of different defined mental illnesses, and it's the most used guide in diagnosing mental illnesses in the psychiatric profession. Now, the definition according to that guide is an abnormality in one's thoughts, feelings, or behaviour, an abnormality being something that statistically isn't common, that causes that individual distress and or makes it difficult or impossible for them to live an adaptive life. Now, the key components that contribute practicality and usefulness to this definition are that for something to be an illness, it must cause distress to the individual and it must inhibit their ability to live an adaptive life. When we apply this definition responsibly, again, no definition of anything is perfect, but when we apply it responsibly, if something is not distressing to the individual and it doesn't stop them from living a healthy life and tending to their needs, then it can't be an illness. It's only once it starts to affect that person in a manner that is negative to them in a relatively objective fashion that we start using that label. Now, one might argue, well, that seems to be common sense. Let's take this hypothetical example. What if we defined mental illness as just being eccentric? Can you imagine how many more people would be considered to be mentally ill? Think of how many eccentricities exist. An eccentricity is really just a characteristic of someone that's not particularly common. Let's say, for example, that very few people like wearing purple clothing. If one person that you see out of every billion wore purple clothing, then by that definition they would be mentally ill. Can you imagine what sort of problems that would cause? We would be unfairly labeling people just based on something that has no real effects on their lives or the lives of anyone else. What's more, if we assume that an illness is something that we need to change or treat, again, we're referring to the implications of the definition, then any person who wore purple clothing or had an unusual sense of humour would be considered to be in need of treatment. And imagine what the mental health profession would be trying to do. It would be trying to change people, stop them from wearing purple clothing when it was having no negative effect on them or anyone else. You may think that's absurd, and yet in history, people who have been eccentric or who strayed from the crowd were considered to be a problem and were unfairly treated, sometimes institutionalized. If somebody had an unusual ability in ancient times, they were considered to be a witch and burned at the stake. And if you teach all the children that are raised in a given generation and subsequent generations and subsequent generations and subsequent generations that an abnormality is bad, what do you expect them to do with that definition? Of course, they're going to consider that anything is bad must be destroyed or eliminated. So, as generations mature and begin to run society, they're going to institute systems that enact their will based on what they think is right. Of course, objectively, this is not right. Just because something is statistically not common does not make it objectively bad. But because we define words that way, they have implications for how we behave in society. Now let's take another word, autism. At one time, autism was considered to be always a mental illness. There are certainly autistic individuals who, due to their particular autistic traits, they're not the same in everyone, but their particular autistic traits, they have trouble functioning. However, not every autistic individual has trouble functioning. Sometimes autism is just a brain type that's statistically not that common, but it's not necessarily always an illness. However, again, if we treat autism as always being an illness, which at one point it may well have been, and we assume by definition that an illness is something which we want to change, then we essentially go down a path of trying to change autistic individuals for no good reason. To give an example, if I was only autistic and I didn't have my other diagnoses, and we assumed autism is always an illness and illness must be changed no matter the consequences, then imagine what people would be trying to change about me. My attention to detail, the fact that perhaps I come across as quite serious. In some parts of the world, autistic people are treated in an extremely abusive manner because of these traits. There are still treatment institutes that essentially torture autistic individuals because they're not normal. But who am I hurting by being a little serious when I talk? Usually because I talk about serious topics, and I think most people actually agree that they're serious topics. But if society was to define autism as always being an illness and they considered my traits to be autistic, if we follow that definition too liberally, then it could be legal to torture me into being less serious. I can tell you now, none of my clients want that. And then you could also explore the implications of the definition of mental health treatment. At some time, it may have been considered that mental health treatment should be enacted regardless of the negative consequences because the changing of the individual in order to conform to society was considered more important than protecting the individual from harm. Nowadays, in civilized societies, we don't enact mental health treatment when there is too significant a risk of harm and too low a chance of actually bringing any benefit to the client. Now let's consider another definition, and this one is extremely difficult, but let's consider the word rights. What are rights? If we define it very loosely as something that everyone should have, then we would have a society in disorder because anybody could define what they want as something that they should have and therefore rights. And if the law provides for rights for everyone, but it doesn't provide a succinct definition of them, then people could expect to be given without contributing, and society would cease to function because we wouldn't have a sense of harmony. People would not understand the concept of take and give. But if it was too rigid and we defined rights as something that only people who work X amount or contribute X amount should have, then it assumes that we live in a fair world in which the only people who don't meet that standard must be to blame, which is obviously not the case. Can you see how difficult that is to define? And importantly, when we choose a definition, what can potentially happen as a result of that? We have definitions for a reason, but often they're not as simple as they sound, and words have more power to us than we realize. And that's why we must be extremely careful when we decide what we're going to believe and how we're going to refer to the world with language. So thank you for joining me for this episode. As per usual, if you have concerns of any description, please consult a professional for advice. And I'd love to hear from my audience. If you have any ideas that you'd like to hear discussed, or if you'd like to collaborate with me or appear on the show, please contact me. I'd love to hear from you. But until next time, take care.